Now I'm going to tell you about how to go about graphing an image. And so for your own projects, you will be working on your 18 by 24 canvas. I've got one here, and you'll be using your own photographs. But for the purpose of the demo, I'm going to use Las Meninas by Diego Velázquez. So the first thing we need to make sure is that the ratio of the image is the same as the ratio of the surface upon which you're graphing it. And so if I was designing a painting from scratch, I would take a photograph or design my layout, and then I would build a stretcher bar to be the same proportions as my drawing. But for this class, we're using 18 by 24, and so you have to make the photograph, or the whatever it is that you're graphing, the proportions of the 18 by 24 canvas, all right? Unless, of course, you're doing an 18 by 18 or a 24 by 24, in which case you'd have to make this square as well. So for this case, it's 18 by 24, and this is probably not the same as that. So let's check. It's 8 inches by 7 inches, a little more than 7 inches. And so 7 by 8, is that the same ratio as 18 by 24? Let's think, what is the smallest fraction that we could make out of 18 by 24? If you want, you could pause this and think about it for a second. Okay, so 18 by 24 is 3/4, because 6, 12, 18, 24, right? Out of 24, 18, 12, 6, okay? So 6 goes 3 ways across, and 6 goes 4 ways up. 6, 12, 18, 24, 6, 12, 18. Make sense? And because that's a 3/4 ratio, we need this to be a 3/4 ratio as well. And it's 7 by 8, so we know that that's not, or almost 7 by 8. So what is a close ratio? I mean, what is the same ratio that's close to the fraction that this is? Well, what about 6/8 instead of 7/8? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, right? So that just means that we need to crop the Velázquez painting a little bit in this way or in this way. We need to cut out 1 inch to make it 6 across, and the height is fine, okay? So, do I want to crop this side? I would lose a child. Do I want to crop this side? I would lose part of the back of the canvas upon which Velázquez is painting. Or I could crop a little bit from both sides. Now, this will really change the composition, and it will change the kind of way that people read the image depending on how you crop it. So we certainly don't want to lose a whole person. But if we get a whole inch away from here, it might not be so clear that he is actually working on a canvas. So if I were to crop it an entire inch over here, I would lose the whole top of this, and it would just look like a line sticking out, right? It would look something like this. And it would be very confusing as to what this is about. So what I'm actually going to do is crop maybe part of it off of here and part of it off of here to lose 1 inch, and I'll be right back. So there are 2 different ways to go about this. I could either crop like I have. You can see I drew a line to crop out part of this and part of this. I was 1 1/4 inches over, so I took away 3/4 here of 1 inch here and 1/2 inch here. And so now I have a 6 by 8. So 8 is the height, 6 is the width, and it's the same ratio as this. Now let's say, look, you can see I actually had to crop out the kid's face, even though I cropped out some of the easel over here as well. So in this drawing, I probably won't even bother putting the little hand in or a little part of the face, because it would just be confusing. I think that guy's just gonna be not part of my painting, all right? But let's say we wanted to leave this entire width here. There's another way to go about it. Instead of cropping the sides down to create a 6 by 8 or a 3 by 4, you know, you could also add a little extra space to the top, which would work here because the top is pretty much just big grayed out kind of greenish gray space, right? So you could add more greenish gray up there without having to really put that much thought into it, right? You wouldn't have to make too much up. And so what you could do is take the entire width, not with the cropped out parts, but the entire width of the bottom, because we want to leave the whole thing in, figure out what that is, and it was 7.25, you'll remember. And then if we divide that by 3, because it's the 3/4 part, you come up with this number, 2.41666 repeating, right? So let's just average that, round it to 2.42. So 2.42 is 1/3 of this width now, because we divided it by 3. And then if we multiply that by 4 to get our height for our 3/4, that would be 9.68 inches. So if I wanted to, I could leave this whole entire part down here and just add on up here. So we'll remember that this is 8 inches, so we just have to add an extra 1.68, so about 1 inch and 2/3 of another inch. So it's gonna be a really whole lot of nothing happening up here. And so I'm just gonna stick with the cropping instead. You could do it either way. So you're gonna be creating your images from scratch. You're gonna be taking photographs to graph onto this. And so you can make sure that it's in the 3/4 orientation from the beginning, okay? So the next thing I'm going to do is, remember that this is not part of the image anymore because I'm doing the 8x6 with the cropping. I'm going to go across and add a grid of equally sized squares here. And I'm also going to add the same number of squares, but the squares will be larger to the canvas. And I want to do this with a really fine H pencil because I don't want a really high H pencil because I don't want those marks coming through, and I want to be able to erase the grid later. So we could do 3 squares by 4 squares because it's 3/4, but it would be beneficial to you to have more squares than that, and you'll see why in a minute. But let's do 6 squares by 8 squares here, and 6 squares by 8 squares here. And so this is a 6 by 8, so each square will be 1 square inch, of course. And then we have 18 by 24, so if we're gonna have 6, it would be 6, 12, 18 by 6, 12, 18, 24. So they'll be larger squares. They'll be, 2 by 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 11, 12. No, 3-inch squares. So see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. And then 18 will get us to 6, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24. So 3-inch squares here, 1-inch squares here. I taped the sides to make it clear to myself that these aren't part of the composition anymore. And then I drew every inch across. I made a mark every inch across here, mark every inch across down, every inch down, and then I used a ruler to connect the lines. Now I told you that you are using a H pencil. Doesn't matter so much on the paper, but it matters a lot on the canvas. I did not use an H pencil because I want it to be dark enough for you to actually see in the video. So I used a B, but you're using an H. You want these lines to be significantly lighter than this, as light as possible. So for this, I drew a mark every 3 inches across the top and bottom, and every 3 inches down the sides, and connected them. So you'll see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and it's the same up. So now that we have this drawn, we don't have to go in and sketch this out, trying to get everything in the right place for the entire composition as a whole. We can go in instead and just see where things start and stop within each square. So it makes it a lot easier to get something exactly like it is in the photo. So looking at this, I could say, for instance, that this starts a little bit to the left of halfway across the square. And of course I'm using this square here. So this is half. It's a little bit less than half. So let's say that's about where the easel starts. And it comes up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 1/5 of the way up the side. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, maybe about here. And then we know that these are straight lines, and that's pretty straight. So we can pull it across and get what this angle is. Pull it down, and then we'll know that that should end right about there. And let's see if that looks right. Yeah, it looks about like it should be about halfway. Mine is a little over halfway, so I'll just pull it back a tiny bit. And I would erase that. All right, so this woman's dress starts about halfway up and right along here. Okay, so a little bit more than halfway up the entire square and a little bit less than halfway up the easel. So a little more than halfway up the square, about halfway up the square, a little less than halfway up, more like there. And it comes to about here. And let's see, it has some kind of texture that goes from this point of the square, but only overlaps the next one a tiny bit. And it goes all the way to here. So this makes it so much easier to get everything in the right spot than it would be otherwise. So the shadow is about 1, 2.5, so about here. The shadow comes up just a little bit into the square, not so much. And then billows down. So you can see what I'm doing here. If I do this with every single square, everything should be perfectly in the exact right spot. And this explains further why it's so important to have this grid really, really light, because now I have to go back and erase these before I actually do the painting. And I'm also going to want to go in and kind of lighten up this stuff too, particularly in doing the glazing method, because that'll show through, because you're using translucent paints in this method. Okay, so let's do a more tricky square, huh? Her face. Let's see where her face is. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So that's the square I'm looking at here. So this square is this square, okay? So that's another neat thing. You could sort of start wherever you want. And so see where the edge is. The edge of the square runs right along that. So her hair starts a little under halfway up. So about there. And her head doesn't go all the way to the top. So her head should end right about here. So let's have the hair. We have to leave some room for the door. The door overlaps a little hard to see, this line just slightly into this side. So the door would come up about like that and hits her hair, which comes down like that, and then it moves into the next square. Let's see how far over her head goes, the back of her head. About halfway. And look, the tip of this girl's nose is right at the square, okay? So the back of her head should end right about here. So I made her a little bit too wide there. Okay, and her hair billows down like this. Doesn't even hit the bottom of this, so it'll have to stay up here. That next girl's nose is just about a third of the way down this, and it just peeks out barely. Poor girl. Bad spacing there, huh? And let's see. There's this dark section here of the armpit that comes just above the edge of the square. So like here, we can see exactly how high it goes and get the angles in there. But you can see that this is a great way to have everything in exactly the right place. And if you wanted to, at this point, you could go back in here and kind of divide up any section that had, and you'd use a ruler and figure out the exact divisions, and figure out exactly where the smaller features are within here. Where do the eyes line up? Where does the mouth line up? You would just have to do the same thing, make it a third of the way across here, and of course really light. So you can divide this up as many times as you want to get in details in the perfect spots. But that is how to graph. So you're going to do the whole thing like I'm doing here before you start painting. And with the glazing method, you really want to get all of the details in with the drawing. You don't have to put in highlights and shadows. You just want to section off kind of where everything is, but so lightly, because you don't want these pencil marks to be there later. All right. Thank you.